we're going to put our patient in a survival suit and tie a rope on him and let him out in the water. Then we're going to steam ahead. Then you need to taxi across the rope.
Oh my gosh.
And have your guy grab the rope.
Welcome to the Coffee in a Hangar podcast. My guest today is Will Johnson. Back in the 80s, Will left a perfectly good job as an engineer for the Westinghouse Corporation to move to Alaska and become a bush pilot. He has some incredible stories, a lot of them about float flying on the ocean, and a lot of knowledge that can only be gained from experience. Enjoy. Mario had once told me a story that he was relaying that you had told him about, I want to say you were rescuing someone off a boat on the ocean.
Yeah, and at that time, I did a lot of those over the years, but at that time, I was so new and so green, I was too dumb to know I didn't belong there. But over the sideband radio, we heard a weak call. We could barely hear it. And we figured out that there was a boat out in the Bering Sea about I think he was about 150 miles out, maybe 75 miles from Cape Pierce. They had a gentleman they described as having a ruptured hernia. And he was in real bad shape, and they need to get him in. And apparently it was too far out for the Coast Guard, and they asked us if there was any way we could get him.
Wow.
And I took off, and they wanted us to bring.
So you're taking off out of Dillingham?
Dillingham.
Okay.
They wanted us to bring a paramedic along, or some kind of nurse or somebody, and had this fellow from the hospital that came along. The problem was I had a new Loran, but it was giving trouble, and it was broken. So I couldn't really navigate to an empty spot of the ocean very accurately. No problem. The boats usually have direction finding equipment, and when you key your marine radio, they can see where the direction and give you directions on where to turn to come into the boat. Turns out this boat, their direction finding equipment was broke. So as I flew out to this imaginary spot, they gave me coordinates, and I put it on the sectional. And I flew out there, and they were coming towards me. And so I was going towards them.
Will you stop for a second and explain me how Lan works?
Loran's kind of the same idea as GPS. It receives signals from different stations, and it looks at the time delay, and it's able to triangulate through the. You have lines of position that each one is separated by a tiny fraction of time.
Got it.
And so if you can get enough stations with lines of position, there's a point where those lines of positions cross each other, and it can figure out where you are.
And so you pinpoint the place where this boat is supposed to be on the sectional chart.
Well, the guy told me his coordinates.
Yeah, so you did the coordinates on the sectional, you have it marked. And then you're using the Loran to try to...
Except my Loran was broke.
Oh, it was totally broke.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, got it.
Yeah,
so you're doing dead reckoning, essentially.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I was able to get a fix off of the NDB at Cape Pierce, the Cape Newingham NDB. And, you can look at your degrees change, how much degrees change you're getting. You can figure out how far you are. So I did that very carefully, so I could, as I passed Cape Newingham, I'd know how far out I was. Trouble is the weather kept coming down lower and lower and lower. Even though the guy said it was great weather, I'm used to boats kind of exaggerating how great the weather is, so they'll get you to come on out. And also the seas were supposed to be flat calm, and I'm looking at the waves getting bigger and bigger. And so we get out there, and I'm starting to think, I'm using time as my distance. And I started thinking, we should be getting out there, and out of the low clouds and the fog, right dead in front of me was this boat. It blew me away. I couldn't have, if I'd kept going, I'd probably run into its superstructure. And so landed. The landing was pretty awful. The first landing failed because the waves bounced us back so high in the sky again. So
What are the ceilings at this point?
Probably down to 300 feet or something like that. And so I bounced up in the sky, and I had to apply a bunch of power to not fall like a wounded duck into the water, and managed to get up and go around. And you know, waves have a kind of a cycle. About every 7 waves, you'll see where things are. So I looked for that and landed successfully. And then I called the boat and said, "We're down. I need you to send your passenger over." And the guy says, "What do you mean? We don't have any way of sending him over. You're going to have to pull up to the boat." And I said, "Well, I don't pull up to anything bigger than me because I don't have enough control to come up close to you that something's going to get ruined on the airplane." And I said, "You got to come up with something." And they said, "Okay, we're going to put our patient in a survival suit and tie a rope on him and let him out in the water. Then we're going to steam ahead. Then you need to taxi across the rope."
Oh my gosh.
"And have your guy that we ask you to send out, the nurse, to grab the rope." And this poor guy is just terrified at this point. And when he got out on the floats, he was so scared that he wouldn't stand up on the floats. He crawled on the floats. And of course, then the waves are washing over and getting him all soaked and everything. But he got the rope and he reeled the guy in. We got him out of his survival suit, got him in the back of the plane. I was expecting a stretcher, so I didn't have any seats or anything back there. And the poor guy was doubled up with pain, and his stomach was all swollen up and red and looked like he was pregnant, you know, it was so badly swollen up. And so we didn't have any blankets, we didn't have anything. And he's, you know, the floor of a 206 is not exactly ideal.
Not flat.
And so we called the boat and said, "Well, we really need some blankets and stuff." And they said, "Oh yeah, we knew that. We're sending over his bag, and we'll put a bunch of blankets in another survival suit or that survival suit, whatever, and we'll zip it up, and then you'll go across the rope again." So I did, and we got all that stuff, and that gave us a lot of things to kind of try to make him comfortable. And he was just doubled up with pain. I felt really bad for the guy. And we kind of tied a seatbelt over him, and he's on the floor and just with blankets and his bag, his sea bag and everything. And at that point, we're all done. And of course, keep in mind, we've been talking on the radio, we've been starting and stopping the engine, and I get ready to start the engine and the battery's dead. And at that point's when I got scared, seriously scared. Because you're out in the middle of the ocean there and out in the Bering Sea, some darn place, and the motor won't start. And so the fallout from that was I subsequently put little handles on the front of the plane so I could have something to hold on to if I needed to prop the engine. And so I turned the propeller over several times so I could find the weakest cylinder. There's always 1 or 2 cylinders that aren't quite as strong as the others.
Right.
And set it near top dead center. And then I waited. I said, you know, batteries, they'll leave them set for a while. Sometimes they'll sort of recover. And I did, and I hit the key, and the propeller turned, and it almost went over compression. And you can see where it's trying to get on across compression. And I just held the key. I had a death grip on that key. It's one where I didn't twist it off in the lock. And it finally got past compression, and it kept turning, and I just held onto that key. And you know, when you have a hot Continental engine, you need to crank it a bit. First you purge the fuel lines, and then you crank it with the throttle open. And by the grace of God, it started. And then we managed to get in the air, beat the heck out of the poor guy on the floor with the waves, and got in the air and then flew back to town. And so I never heard what happened to him. We got him to the hospital. I didn't do a medevac into town for him, so I never heard, but he sure didn't look very good. Hopefully they were able to fix him up. But there were a lot of interesting adventures. One of the things we did, I called creative dispatching, where they would send people over in the land planes, and then I would pick them up in Togiak. You know, we had a little shack there we called our Togiak terminal, had fuel there and everything. and then I'd load them and take them out on the water for the herring fleet. And I spent a lot of time on the northern Bering Sea and the rivers and the bays, or river outlets and bays and so on. And they'd send people over, and then I'd take them out, and I'd pick people up that needed to come in, and I'd drop them off at our shack, and then they just kept running planes back and forth. Because to run the float plane clear back to Dillingham was incredibly inefficient. It was slow and it didn't carry much.
Right.
But if all I was doing was making little 10-minute shuttles out on the ocean, we could move a bunch of people in a hurry.
Right. Got it.
So I'm at the end of the day, and they, there was a place out there that I could call and say, okay, I got this last bunch delivered. No, they don't have anybody else to come in. Do you have anything else for me? And they said, well, we have one more passenger for you. And so these passengers were what we called the Slimline Workers. You know, they were catcher processor boats, and they would work the processing lines. And they were students from trying to find work for the summer.
Yep.
And so they said, yeah, we sent one more over on the cleanup trip. So we brought some of the local villagers over and some freight, and we brought this one more passenger. So I pull into the terminal there after I landed, and there is this beautiful, tall black woman. And she's dressed like she's going to a party. She's got a short skirt and bright red blouse and a little beret on her head, and she was just absolutely stunning, and high heels, standing there in this front of this grubby old shack in the gravel with these high heel shoes. And I thought, wow, this gal's in for a shock when she gets on the boat. She's going to be working the Slimline, because she's obviously very classy dressed and very beautiful and everything. And I stopped the motor and got out of the airplane, and she looked at me and she said, and I can't talk like they talk in Chicago. And she says, am I getting on that thing? And I said, yes, if you want to go to the boat. And you could just hear the resignation in her voice, like this was her last day and she was going to die. She said, the planes just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So,
It's so true, though.
It is
It's like
true.
you come in, then you go, and then you go again,
Yeah.
and then it's like, what?
So I got her on the plane and got her to a little skiff out in the middle of the ocean, and then the skiff transferred her over to her
Wow.
processing boat, and I never saw her again. But I hope it worked out for her.
So this processing boat thing, they would send a skiff out to meet you,
Yeah,
because it's a big ship. I mean, it's like,
right. You can't go up
Yeah.
to one. I've made that mistake one time. I didn't ever make it again,
what do you mean?
where I went up to a boat.
Tell me about it.
Well, the problem is these boats are anchored, and you notice which way they're turned. And if you're not thinking, like there's been a time or two in my life I haven't thought very clearly, then you say, okay, I know what the wind's doing because it's got those boats turned a certain way. The trouble is there are some incredible currents out there in the ocean. And if a boat's turned a certain way on anchor, it's likely got nothing to do with what the wind's doing. It's got to do with that current. So I have this thing all scoped out based on what the wind's doing, and I had to go up to this boat and get a bag. And as it turns out, the current at fairly high rate of speed swept me right in towards this boat. And I realized very quickly, too late of course, that I had no reverse on the airplane and I had no room to turn, and I'm going to smash the wing right into the boat at a high rate of speed, and I'm going to ruin everything.
Wow.
And I did something that in my wildest dreams I could never imagine doing. But I shut off the engine and jumped out of the plane, climbed up on the roof of the cabin, and ran across the top of the wing to the wingtip. And just before the wingtip smashed into the boat, I was able to reach out and I might have got down on my knees, I can't remember, and stop it from smashing into the boat.
So you just went out there and pushed?
Yeah, and pushed hard.
No.
And so they realized that I was in big trouble. They were watching all this and probably laughing. And so they sent a boat out to rescue me and pull me away from a small boat, a skiff with an engine. And when they did, then they, I at this point had climbed down and let the wing rest very gently against the boat, but things were still out of control. And I jumped down on the float and held onto the boat and held onto the strut, and they tried to pull me away, and they about pulled me in too. And I just...
Your body, they pulled
my
because
body,
you're like...
I'm trying to hang on and not destroy this beautiful airplane. And I don't remember exactly how I got out of that mess, but eventually we got the plane away from because we're trying to pull the plane sideways. It didn't go sideways very well because that's where the current was coming from, forcing it against there. So,
how many years at that point had you been in Alaska flying when you made that mistake?
I'd probably been there a year or two. What happened is I went to Bethel, got the Bethel operation started, and I was there till after the first of the year. So we were there about maybe 7, 8 months, and went down to Dillingham. And then when the spring came, the company had a big business hauling fishermen using the land planes to the beach, which is not really a good deal because you get a lot of corrosion out of that, with sand and salt and everything.
More so than a float plane on the ocean?
Surprisingly so, because I don't think we thought about taking care of them, whereas the float plane got a bath every night and then complete relube. Got a high pressure hot water bath, and including poking the wand into every little opening you could and flushing.
And no one thought, this is salt sand, basically.
Yeah,
it's getting underneath everything, getting in the...
Yeah, so they dropped people off on the beach, and then the skiffs would come in from the big boats and pick people up the beach. So we got really far behind, and the owner, Phil, said, "Well, can you, we've got the float plane on a certificate and my check ride and everything," and he said, "Can you help us with these people that need to go to the beach?" So I did, and I landed in the water, and then I went to the beach and waited on the skiff to come into the beach where I could pick up the people he was bringing in, and because there were always people changing out, and give him the people I had.
Like near canneries and stuff, or was it for
it was
set
for
netting? And
it was for processor boats that were waiting on the herring to show up.
Got it.
So they just wanted their crew members, so we'd drop them off on the beach with the land planes, and then they'd come into the skiff and do all that. Well, here I'm trying to do this now with the float plane, and I'm in the water, and these waves are crashing on the shore, and I couldn't keep the plane straight. It went sideways to the shore, which, that's what they like to do, is go parallel to the swells. And so I opened my float compartment to get a guy's bag out, and this big wave crashed over and filled the float compartment and flooded his bag. And so I wasn't very happy with that, and neither was he.
This is like your first flight?
It was my first time to go out and take people to the beach.
Okay.
And I said, "This is ridiculous." And I said, "From now on out, I'm not doing this beach thing. I'm going to meet people out in the water." And then you don't have that surf breaking and all that.
Yep.
And so that's all I did from then on out, except I did learn not to transfer big, giant, heavy things out in the water.
What do you mean by that?
Oh, like I like big electric motors and cylinder heads for big diesels and all that.
How did you learn that?
They had a boat that was stranded out in Togiak Bay, and everybody was gone. The herring season was over, but these guys were still there at anchor out in Togiak Bay. And they had 2 engines on their boat, and they were both dead, and they were going to get one going with a cylinder head. So they got their cylinder head in a few days. It was in a wooden box, put it in the plane with a fork truck. I mean, this thing must have weighed 300 pounds or so, really heavy. And so we get out there, and I think I had somebody helping me, and they sent a skiff out with 3 people on board, and one of the things we did is we got too many people on one float, so it started to go down on that side. And we're trying to wrestle this thing out, and we successfully wrestle it out, and we're holding on to it, and we're going to transfer it to the skiff. And about then, there's a wooden box. The end came off the wooden box, and this big cylinder head comes slithering out of the box, and it smashes on top of the float and bounces, did some damage. Not much, but fortunately. And then it went over the side. And when it went over the side, we were all grabbing for it, not very successfully. but it hit the chine on the side, the edge of it, and it hung on that, the edge of the float there. And meanwhile, we had our hands on it so it couldn't tip out. And we managed to salvage that darn thing. It's soaked in salt water, but it would have been okay. So I said, okay, we're never doing this again. The way we will do this is we will go to the shore. We will back onto the shore where the plane is solid, where the one float won't sink if too many people get on it. And then we'll transfer it to a boat.
Back the plane in.
Back the plane in and then pull the boat in beside of it. So
you're going to do an engine, you got to have calm water because you're going to have no breakers or no surf or whatever.
As best you can, or try to agree to meet on a place that's protected or sheltered or that kind of thing.
What's the biggest wave that you could land on doing that?
You know, I flew the Beaver some, and it was better than the 206, but the 206 did have the PK floats that were kind of a deep V. So the beauty of the deep V is they can handle a little bit rougher water, but
because they cut it open, kind of, or sort of they break it. Why is that?
Well, it's just a deep V, and I think it cuts into the water a little better and doesn't. But that same deep V hurts the performance off smooth water. But salt water has a little more flotation than fresh water, so that I think helps a little bit. But, you know, you always like a little wind and a little bit of chop. That helps you get airborne. But the problem, when you get too many waves, it's just so hard on the airplane. It just beats the airplane to death. So you ask what you could handle. I would say when you start to see 1.5 feet or 2 feet, you were starting to get in trouble, you know. That there were some tricks that you could use. Maybe in certain conditions, you could take off parallel to the waves, to the swells. Or in a few cases, I'd get behind a boat that was going somewhere and use that was smoother. And plus had some air mixed in a little bit.
Really? So you have like that area where they're what do you call that part of the boat where it comes off of the back?
Bow wake or whatever.
The wake, you have that smooth area in the middle. You just kind of get in there. A little bit
smoother. You could get in there and get started, you know, and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of little tricks you could do, but you reached the point where you just couldn't do anymore. And there was 2 or 3 times that I said, this ain't going to work. I'd managed to get on the water and then realize, hey, the takeoff's going to be a lot longer and I'm going to beat this plane to death taking it off. So I would taxi a long, long ways to get to some protected water. And when you get there, sometimes you had to repump the floats out because they'd taken such a beating getting over there. Plus the water would kind of leak in the tops of the floats and stuff. And so.
Do you ever fall off of the float out there trying to do stuff and you're in rough seas or something?
Well, that's a good question. I fell off a couple of times on land and kind of hurt myself. Because if you stood on the top of the float at the edge, the angle on each side, then that was slippery because originally when we painted the tops of the float with anti-skid, we just did in between those. You don't want to do in between them. You need to do over them too in case your foot's on the edge. So I slipped off a couple of times that way, and I also slipped a couple of times into the water, but fortunately didn't let go of the airplane because if there's any wind, the plane is blowing backwards at a pretty fast clip, faster than you can swim. So if you slip off into the water, if you don't get your hands on that plane really quick, that's the end of you.
You know how sailboats have the rope out the back, and that way if you fall off, you can grab it. You know, people that sail by themselves and stuff do that. Does the plane have something like this?
Yeah, a lot of people will trail a rope from their tail tie down. I never did do that. Maybe I should have, but I didn't do it. Other people will have a rope off the wingtips. They're going to help with handling. That drove me nuts because I could see that rope moving in my peripheral vision, and as I just thought, oh my God, I'm about to have a midair.
Constantly.
And having been to a midair at one point, I didn't like that constant movement in my peripheral vision, so I didn't ever keep ropes on the wingtips.
Man, I wonder what the next thing you should tell me about is. Maybe a midair?
Well,
let's look. Do you mind telling me about
I did, and of course I got in a lot of trouble with FAA, but we took a proactive approach and FA worked with me, and I had an ALPA attorney that didn't cost me anything. His name was Steve Dodge, and a lot of people would remember him. His dad was Red Dodge and flew the Hercs on the slope before Neil Burke got going with his Hercs. And amazing guy, a pilot, attorney, and his idea was to avoid at all cost a adversarial relationship with FAA. And he worked that so well, and we made some commitments of things I would do, including some talks and going on the TV weather program and things like that, that we ended up working through the whole deal. And it turned into what I think was a positive outcome for everybody. You know, FAA had an advocate for not having mid-airs, and they worked with us.
So, I mean, do you mind telling me the story of how you had a mid-air?
Before I go any further, as pilots, we do a self-assessment. Just because we have a medical that runs out on so-and-so date, if we don't feel good today,
right,
we need to put a stop right there. We can't say, oh, I still got 2 months on my medical. I don't care if I'm dying, I can still fly.
Yeah.
You don't do it that way.
Yeah.
So there's been a couple of times where I had emotional issues and shouldn't have been flying. And that morning, my mother had died. That's definitely an emotional issue.
Right.
And so there were a couple of Japanese fellows that showed up to go out to herring grounds. Turns out they were people who inspected the sample catches of the fish to see if they were ripe, if it was time to fish for herring. So I had to take them out. They were an integral part of the herring fishing getting started. And I wanted to get that job done. There wasn't any flights I could get on that early. And it turns out the weather was bad. So hung around a good part of the day waiting for the weather to get better, and finally the weather did get better. And for some reason, these guys didn't fly with us from Dillingham. They flew to Togak, and they were sitting over there waiting in our little terminal, which was just a little shed, a little more than a little shed. And so I finally was able to get over there and pick them up. And going over to the boat, which I believe was a Pacific producer, a helicopter was carrying a long line. And he didn't see me and I didn't see him, but at the last minute I saw him. And it turns out he was going to the same boat. And I was on my approach. I'd flown a left base and was turning final for my landing. And when I saw him, we were on a hard collision course, and I put the nose down. And I could see that wasn't working, so I put it down harder. And I put it down so hard that every little scrap of gravel, some screwdriver bits in my flight bag, everything hit the ceiling and the airplane, the windows and everything. So it actually went negative. But it was very successful in putting me underneath him, probably 30 or 40 feet, which is close, but I'd rather that than. But as it turns out, he had a long line hanging down underneath. And the long line had a brailer full of the fish that these two Japanese guys were supposed to look at.
Yeah.
And I didn't see the cable. And the helicopter was very hard to see because it was a modeled background of snow and brown, and it was a dirty white helicopter. And it was really hard to see with the background. And so I heard a little faint noise, and I saw a circle appear in the dust. There was a tiny bit of dust on the windshield, and that had, from some splatter rain and then dried, and I could see this little about foot diameter circle on the windshield. I said, what the heck is that? And I said, oh my God, I've hit his tie-down rope. So I was very concerned that I didn't realize I had any damage. I was very concerned.
What do you mean he hit his tie-down rope?
I thought he might have a tie-down rope hanging down from his skid or something.
Okay.
I didn't know what he had, but I just knew I'd hit something, and I knew it was associated with that because I never saw it. And so I flew on out past him, and then I turned around to see where he was. I was scared to death I'd knocked him out of the sky. I was still fine. But I was scared to death I'd knocked him out of the sky. And finally, I spotted him in the western sky, backlighted by some sun behind some clouds. And I looked, and I could see this frayed, he's a long ways off, but I had good vision, and I could see this frayed cable hanging down. And then I knew what happened. I'd hit he must have had a log line. And even though I was on 22.9, I'm not sure what he was on, and never made contact with him, except finally through the marine radio. So once I saw he was flying okay, then I made a landing to let my people out. And when I got out of the airplane, I saw that cable had wrapped around the leading edge of the wing root and had kind of mashed that fairing that goes between the wing and the cabin, just mashed it a little bit. Mm. And then it had sliced the plastic off the top of the rudder, the plastic fairing. And so at the same time, it had sliced the power supply for the beacon light off, which was also the counterweight for the rudder. And then the prop had these gigantic gashes. Each blade had a terrible injury about halfway through the blade, and a serious nick, in other words. Mm-hmm. And that's what severed the prop. If it hadn't severed the prop, or if the cable would have hit the wing, it'd have been all over probably for both of us.
So you're saying that the cable hit the prop?
It hit the prop, and the prop severed it, and that's the only thing that saved us.
And then whatever the severing piece of the cable that was still connected to the helicopter hit your wing root and your tail.
Exactly, and
Crazy.
Sliced off. So at that point, I'm on the water, and there were some people wanted to go back with me, and I said, I can't take you. And I was trying to debate what to do, because you absolutely cannot leave an airplane out there. If you want to lose it, that's a good way to do it. Yeah, absolutely. So I flew to Togiak, which is just a few miles away. And because I knew it would fly, because it had been flying. And I flew to that, and I stopped and got a ferry permit, and then brought it home, and then jumped onto the plane to go to my mother's funeral. So the FAA, rightfully so, issued some pretty serious violations. But they kind of laid it all on me, which I didn't think was very fair. When in fact, if you look at the right-of-ways rules for landing traffic, the airplane typically has the right-of-way over the helicopter. Mm-hmm. But I didn't care who had the right-of-way. I just don't want those things to happen.
Yeah. What are the violations? What did they violate you for?
Well, the one they always get you on is careless and reckless, which is real serious, and failure to see and avoid. That's the biggies right there. Mm-hmm. But they were happy that I got a ferry permit. They weren't terribly happy that I approved the ferry permit. What
do you mean that you approved it?
Well, when the FAA issues a ferry permit, it's really not complete until the mechanic examines the damage and decides the airplane's safe for intended ferry flight. You're not saying it's airworthy. You're just saying it's the airplane's safe for intended ferry flight. And
you were the one that examined it? And
I looked at it, and I said, well, it flew till I landed on the water, and then it flew up here. I think maybe it'll fly back home. I got to get it out of here. And you can't leave an airplane in the village usually that's disabled. Bad things happen to it.
It'll get tampered with.
I wanted out of there, and it was my pride and joy and my, lifetime achievement award.
Was that your airplane at this point?
Yeah, it was leased to the company, so my airplane. Mm-hmm. So I got the ferry permit, got it back home, and they were later kind of critical of flying it with that propeller, and rightfully so, having these big nicks in them, nicks that were halfway through the blade.
They were halfway through the blade?
About right at halfway, at least one or two of the blades, but all had serious damage.
So if it's halfway through, it's less than half, it's more than half the material. Yeah. Because the trailing edge is thinner, right? So it was...
Yeah, it was so, but at the same time, it was out, within 6 inches of the tip. And I don't know where those blades went. They're somewhere, but I don't have them.
Oh, that's too bad.
Somebody does. Anyway, I had worked for Westinghouse on turbine blades and turbine blade failures of similar type different materials and all that. But at the same time, I'm in a plane that can land on the water, and I just said, I got to get this thing out of here. And the proof was in the pudding. It was safer for intended ferry flight. But they said, well, why didn't you call the propeller manufacturer and get approval for that? Propeller manufacturer's not going to approve that. It's all
right. How are you going to get them to approve that? They would never do that.
All down
lawsuits galore.
So, anyway, the plane had to have quite a bit of expensive repair work and so on. But basically, it was okay, and everybody survived okay.
And you're lucky to be alive, probably.
I feel very lucky to be alive from that. And
so when they had you go around and do this, these talks and stuff, what were the points that they wanted you to make? Because it's not just you; it's telling the story, right? There was like certain things you had to say, correct?
Well, yeah, and I think overall that my performance wasn't what it should have been, because this giant black cloud hanging over my head of my mother's passing.
Yeah.
And you just don't really realize how that's going to impact you until it happens, And us guys are tough, and we can still function with something like that, but can we really? So I think that's the main thing. But then part of it is just, being incredibly vigilant when you're flying, and especially out there in the herring season when they've got maybe 100 airplanes flying around. Now, it turns out there were almost nothing at that moment, but when they start spotting, it's just like a big hairball of airplanes out there.
Yeah.
And they have collisions occasionally. It's amazing. But those days are over. Those giant herring seasons we don't have them anymore. So the Japanese people got poor. It was a very expensive product, and at the same time, the young people didn't care for it. They wanted McDonald's hamburgers, and so that is gone. You still see a little bit of it, but it's nothing like what it was. There was one year they had 850 boats out there. You just about walk from boat to boat,
Crazy.
It was beyond crazy, and the amount of airplanes was unbelievable. And there were some amazing catches. There was one guy that I would do business with, taking people in and out and supplies and what have you. And he had a $750,000 catch in a 20-minute opening, which is not too bad of money. So, but not everybody did it. It's a little bit like the lottery.
Yeah. Other types of flying that you did, I kind of understand the type of flying that a company like Midair would have done. I understand the types of jobs. You guys are hauling mail to villages and stuff. Was there any other kinds of flying other than that you did that you enjoyed? Or is there?
Well, I did a lot of these medevacs.
Okay.
Quote unquote medevacs.
Why do you say quote unquote?
Well, because there weren't any of them legal.
Okay. What's illegal about that?
Well, there's several things. You need approved berths for your passengers.
Approved what?
Berths.
Okay.
Place for a legal approved place for passenger to be strapped in,
Okay.
Either a special kind of bench that's installed in the plane that can hold them down, or something like that. The problem that we ran into in those days is the hospital's position was, gee, we're not gonna pay for that kind of stuff. We want to save that money for medicines and Band-Aids and hire more nurses and doctors. And my position was, hey, if we can't get the passengers in, what good is all this other stuff?
Yeah.
So I was constantly at war with the hospitals over that sort of thing. And the big problem was I think that disturbed FAA more than anything was flight and duty. Flight duty is a big deal. If you're tired, then everything else kind of falls apart.
Flight duty.
Flight and duty time, how much you can fly.
Yeah.
And the rest periods.
Okay, so that's the other thing that was possibly illegal that you may or may not.
That was the big thing I think that bothered FAA.
So you had just flown a full day hauling mail and passengers from the villages, and then in the evening, you're all timed out essentially, and you get a call.
And the trouble is that the people that were getting hurt, they would get hurt in the afternoon or evening, and by the time they made it to the clinic in the village and got approved for transport and then made it to the hospital in town, it was late at night. And so there were really 2 medevacs. There was one to get the person into town where they could go to the hospital from the clinic in the village. And then once you were done at the hospital in town, then there was a second medevac that took them into Anchorage. So sometimes I'd do both of them. And
what plane would you take them to Anchorage in?
Navajo.
Okay.
Navajo is what we'd use. But the 207s were typically, 207 and Navajo is what we used in the villages.
Wow.
The problem is that in the evening, the pilots were off duty and they'd have a couple of beers and nobody in town was legal. And they didn't want to avoid having their beers just in case a medevac would come along.
Yeah.
So I would absolutely avoid any kind of alcohol. Figuring sooner or later there would be a flight that was needed, and very often it was. So they were just ordinary charters to us. And so ultimately, the FAA started putting a lot of pressure on us. And they said, well, you understand that if somebody's dying in the village or a child's hurt or something, you're going to go take care of them. But then why are you flying the next day? The next day is not an emergency. Well, you're flying the next day because you're trying to stay alive, and you maybe did a $150 trip to the village to rescue a hurt kid that's been bit by dogs or whatever. And you lost $2,000 worth of revenue the next day by staying grounded. So I started charging for that. And
charging for what?
For the damage to the next day's work.
And who would you charge?
The hospital.
Got it.
So they got mad at me and they quit using me. And the sad story is that a friend of mine lost his wife. She got hurt in the village, and they wouldn't call me, and his wife didn't come to town, and she died in the village overnight. Yeah, it was a really sad deal. And I never quite forgave the hospital for that. And they told the husband that, well, the weather was bad, which it wasn't. It was perfectly good weather. And they also said there were no pilots available. I was totally available, but they wouldn't call me because...
You were sitting there in your house all sober.
Yeah, but
I was just waiting.
They didn't want to pay that extra.
Oh, man.
I think that charge was, at the time, was $450, and they didn't want to pay that. And they actually, I picked up a prescription one day, and there's a big sign on the wall, "Don't call Will Johnson for Medevacs. He charges a call out." But I didn't call it a call out. I called it a damage to next day's business. But the good news is that...
Just trying to stay legal.
Yeah. The beautiful thing is that in today's world, we're doing so much better now. The hospitals have realized that, hey, we need to have planes on standby, not just some guy that's been flying all day and wore out. But you know, back in those days, things were kind of wild and woolly, but they're really stepping to the plate now and using the right kind of airplanes to do the job. And plus the runways are better, so a lot of times they can get a flight direct from the village straight into town. And so you got to hand it to people like Guardian, and I forget, there's another one that does that work too.
Do you have any other, Debbie, what was your favorite, you were saying your favorite story?
So my son Matt wanted an airplane. We heard about an airplane that a fellow by the name of Herman Beaver had at Quig, which was wintertime, and the landing gear was buried in a big giant pool of water that had frozen ice. And the plane was just out in the cold, and the snowplow had hit one wing, and he went out there, and to his credit, he rescued that airplane. And so he was very proud of this airplane, and he eventually got his private license. At the time, when this particular incident I'm about to relate occurred, he did not have his private license. He'd been taking training, but he hadn't finished. So he's working at a fishing lodge, sport fishing lodge up the Nushagak River. And he called on the radio one evening, because they didn't have any phones or anything up there, just a radio, and called on the radio. "Hey, Dad, I want to show my fellow guides and the guests my airplane. Will you please jump in my airplane and fly up here and fly by the camp a couple of times?" And I did.
So he just wants you to go do a pass so he
can
tell you.
And I had radio contact with him, and I did that. So I'm flying home, and I guess I had ants in my pants or something. I just couldn't stand it that I hadn't really finished the evening. So I said, well, I'm going to run up in the McClung Hills, which was pretty close to where the Stevens accident occurred. And there was a little creek up there, and I wanted to get out and look in that creek and see if I could see any fish, because I had a plan to come up there and go fishing. So it was a little bit windy, and I landed and went down and looked at the creek, and it had fish in it. It was a really neat place where the little river flowed, McClung River flowed between some great big giant rocks. It was really a nice place. And I go back up and I get in the airplane and I look and say, oh my gosh, there's no way I can get this thing airborne. There's not enough runway. I really blew it. And a 150 will land in a lot shorter room than it'll take off. This one had 40-degree flaps. So I said, well, no problem. I got a back taxi. So I back taxied, and when I did, I got into some really soft ground. I got away from the kind of the gravel on top of the ridge and some terrible soft ground. And the plane, but I did get back a ways, but the plane sank into the mud, just buried the wheels up to the tops of the rubber. And
can I clarify a couple things for this story?
Absolutely.
You're landing on a ridge of a mountain.
Yeah.
It's a runway that you've landed on before?
Never landed on, but people used it. You could tell people
used it.
Yeah.
And so you've landed there and you say, well, I can't take off in this. So you're back taxiing, but you're taxiing sort of beyond what the normal place where people would land is.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Got it. Sorry.
And it was dumb that I didn't figure all this out before I landed.
Well, I mean,
so I get taxied back and the thing sinks into the ground. And I'm wearing shorts and t-shirt, and the mosquitoes are starting to eat me alive, and I'm totally unprepared. Nobody knows where I am. We didn't have the kinds of phones and locators and all that other stuff. I mean, just beyond dumb. And that's what we do in Alaska. We do dumb things like they do in the lower 48, except for us, it's so remote that it's a lot more serious when we do dumb things. So I get out of the airplane and I realize I got to get this plane on top of the ground again. So using my bare hands, I'm digging into the soil, which is really cold, and getting dirt jammed under my fingernails. And I'm digging up clumps of tundra. And I got all of these clumps of grass and mud and everything dug up with gravel mixed in with it. And I had to lift the airplane up at the strut, at the wing strut. Because if I went out on the wingtip, one, I couldn't lift high enough, and two, how am I going to get the stuff I collected under the wheels? So I had to lift it and stand on one leg and use the other leg to kick this stuff under the wheels. So I got the plane back up on top. The trouble is, to get it under the nose, you'd normally go back on the tail and push down, but there was nobody up front to put the stuff under the nose. So I had to lift at the propeller, which is really hard to do because you don't have the leverage. So I get it up on top of the ground. Then I managed to work the tail around and get it turned around. And of course it sinks in the mud a couple more times. And I got to keep doing this exercise of getting more clumps of tundra underneath the wheels. And I finally get it pointed the right way. And I jump in and give it the gas, and it rolls about 2 feet and sinks into the mud and stops. And I did that a couple more times, and just there was obviously no way to get anywhere. And I said, well, the problem is I need somebody to push the airplane while I give it the gas, but I didn't have anybody. So the next conclusion is, and I know this sounds really dumb, I'm going to have to push the airplane from outside the airplane to get it rolling.
Totally.
And then once it's going good, I'll jump in the airplane. So I was able to push the throttle in, lock it, and then push on, and of course it wants to turn left, but I'm pushing on the left strut. So between the two, I more or less balanced out. I was able to push it without my weight in there, and with me pushing the airplane, it was able to get rolling pretty good. And then I was able to jump in, which today I couldn't do that, but I did it then. It's amazing what you can do when the adrenaline's up. And I got in and got my feet on the rudder pedals and managed to get airborne. And
so that was your takeoff roll, the start of your takeoff. You weren't even just getting unstuck. That was the start of your takeoff roll.
It was, yeah. And I was not in the airplane for the first 20 feet or something like that.
Did you buckle before you got off the ground?
I know.
Jeez,
Definitely like
No, that's not the part that the FAA would. I mean, they probably wouldn't like that either. But that's that is such an incredible story.
It did work.
Mm-hmm.
Got going. So
That's the one thing I've never understood. I'll go out with my friend, meet them out there somewhere, and it's middle of summer, right? But they were like wearing shorts and flip flops, and hey, I'm gonna get my camping gear out. No, never carry camping gear in their plane. It's like, which I mean, it sounds like that's kind of the norm with people. And if you have other things you're carrying, like why carry camping gear? Or in that situation, if you'd had gear, maybe you wouldn't have been able to take off at all, right? But it's
my kid's airplane. It wasn't equipped. My airplane had a survival kit in it.
Yeah.
This plane was totally empty. It didn't even have a paper towel to wipe the dipstick off. But fortunately, it wasn't very full of gas either. But I saw fish. But for some reason, my appetite for going back to that airstrip was zero. I never did it again.
Never did it again.
The following year, a guy had heard I'd been up there, and he called me on the radio and asked what he thought about him landing his 185 up there. And I said, well, I wouldn't do it. I said, it's deceiving, it's pretty soft, and you'd be better off not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
He landed anyway, and I think about a month and a half later before they finally got the plane out of there.
Anything else? Is there a story that that you have that's just like blow me away that I would miss out on if I didn't ask you?
Well, there's probably a whole bunch of them, but I don't know.
Give me one more that you think I should hear.
The problem with this Amphib 206 is that was before I got a big engine and a big prop on it.
Mm.
It was seriously underpowered, especially considering that it had the PK 3500 amphibs. Seriously underpowered. So I got very good at making step turns.
Mm.
And if I had a lake, especially if it had a little bit more length and width, I could make a step turn and then I could get off.
Mm.
I'd get it on step. The challenge with that airplane was getting it on step. If you could ever get it on step, it would fly. But if I used every trick in the book to get it on step. I mean, there's no end of things that I would do to make it get on step.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, if you don't think there's any big rocks next to shore, stay near the shallow water. Stay in the shallow water.
Because it's easier to get on step.
Yeah, it'll get on step a lot easier.
Got it.
If there's some lily pads, it'll get on step on the lily pads better.
Really?
So anyway, one day, Fish and Wildlife, they called us and they wanted us to fly them to a lake on the peninsula there south of Dillingham. What the heck did they call that? Down towards Picnic Beach, Cape Constantine, yeah. And they wanted us to fly them to a lake, this little small lake. Mm-hmm. And then they wanted to do some bird research to figure out the interaction between the caribou and the birds. They'd done some introduction of caribou down there. And then my friend Steve Huddleston, he got the easy job. He flew them in there. So, you could fly them in there heavy, unload them and take off, no big deal. Mm-hmm. So then it comes time to go down and transfer them to another lake. So I calculated the fuel down to the last pint, what I would need on board that airplane to go down there, pick those people up, make 3 loads over to this other lake, because it's 3 loads, get them in, and then fly back home and not run out of gas. I had it figured down perfectly and still have a half-hour reserve. And that's the trouble with float planes. You're always running around out of gas. Mm-hmm. And I did have a fuel totalizer, which was pretty nice and did the job. So I flew down there and they were there waiting on me. And there was a young lady there, I'm trying to remember her name, I think it's Michelle Johnson. She's a real sparkling personality, a lot of fun to be around and everything. And the other gentleman, I can't remember his name, but he was kind of a dour Norwegian. He was a really quiet guy. He didn't have 2 words to say. And so I got her loaded, and she was a fairly lightweight female, and we put in what we thought was about the right amount of gear. And I did a step turn to get out of there and took her over to the other lake and dumped her off. Then I flew back and picked up just nothing but cargo. So a big heavy load of cargo, made a step turn, got airborne. And one of the things about that airplane, it kept you honest. You couldn't overload that airplane. If you thought you were going to overload it, you just wouldn't get off the water. It just wasn't going to get on step. So you really had to be honest about your weights, not fool yourself.
Yeah.
So I got that load hauled over, and I come back to get the last load and him hauled over. And I get all loaded, and it looks like it's pretty straightforward and about the right amount of weight. And I make my step turn, and I take off. And I get about 100 feet in the air, right over the edge of the far edge of the lake, and the engine quits. Just quits cold. Ooh. And the thought went through my mind is I always wondered how these floats would do on tundra. I'm about to find out. And just at that moment, I spotted something that I'd never noticed before, but to the left and kind of in front of me was this little tiny pond covered with lily pads. You couldn't even see the water, but I thought, well, wait a minute, if there's lily pads, it's got to be water.
Oh, gosh.
And so I headed for that.
Hey guys, we'll get right back to the interview, but first, let's talk about the easiest way that you can support us in making more content like this. So this program is self-funded, meaning that if you want to support us, all you have to do is go to my company's website, sportaircraftseats.com. We make aircraft seat upholstery kits that can be installed by an owner or mechanic in just a few minutes with little to no skill. Now, the process that we've created makes it very easy. You can design and order your seats right on our website. We'll then make them according to your customizations and what seat frames you have, and we'll ship them right to your door. We have instructional videos that walk you through every step of the installation, and we have a comfort and fit guarantee. Open a new browser window and go to Sport Aircraft Seats to check us out.
The thought went through my mind is I always wondered how these floats would do on tundra. I'm about to find out. And just at that moment, I spotted something that I'd never noticed before, but to the left and kind of in front of me was this little tiny pond covered with lily pads. You couldn't even see the water, but I thought, well, wait a minute, if there's lily pads, it's got to be water.
Oh, gosh.
And so I headed for that. And meanwhile, I tried to think what I'd done, and I said, well, okay, I don't remember what I did. I switched tanks because I'd burned up enough fuel out of the first two loads. I needed to switch the other tank. And so I knew that when I landed, even though the tank was pretty much empty that I'd been on, I knew that I needed to undo what I'd just done.
Yeah.
So I switched back to that tank that had been feeding, and I hit the fuel boost. And just as I hit this edge of the pond, I barely made it to this pond within inches to spare. And I'm scooting across this itty bitty pond on these lily pads, which are just incredibly slippery and not slowing me down at all. And I'm going to smash into the other shore.
Yeah.
Just as I'm just thinking, well, I'm going to really tear things up here in a second, the engine took off. And I don't know why the engine took off, but I'm going for it. And I managed to get airborne just inches before the other shoreline.
Dude.
And I'm climbing out and wondering, is the engine going to quit again? And I'm sitting there, just shaking and scared to death. What in the heck did I just do wrong now? And then it started to sink into the fog of war that when I switched tanks and then took off with the same kind of step turn, that I had slung the fuel in the wing tanks out to where my inboard unported. Now, any idiot could figure that out, but I'd never thought of that.
Will you explain that to me?
Well, you have tanks in your wings, right? And the pickups are inboard by your head, by the cabin.
Yep.
So if you make a step turn, then the fuel that's remaining in that tank gets thrown to the outer part of the tank, and your fuel line that drains the tank is unported.
Well, unported meaning gets air.
It's just getting air. It's
Yeah.
just sucking air.
So then when the fuel sloshes back, you've got this
once
air.
you're flying, and then you got to But see, I'd made a step turn and the fuel probably did slush back, but I got a column of air. Plus I emptied the reservoir tanks that are under the seats, which are under the floor, under your feet, which are designed to deal with this situation. But I had exhausted, in this big step turn, I had exhausted that fuel.
Got it.
Just when I got in the air.
Just enough to, wow.
Yeah, and there's no way that getting straightened out or anything would have gotten that bubble of air and the lines out and then filled the little reservoir tank again. It just wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
But by switching to the other tank, then those lines were all full, the reservoir tank's full, everything's good to go, even though the tank's nearly empty. So I'm just shaking, and I turned to my passenger, who, even loading the plane, we didn't have 2 words. We just both kind of knew what to do. And I said, I think I figured out what happened. And he said, yeah. And I said, yeah, I think I imported the tank when I made that turn. And then I said to him, how did you stay so calm? Because he just sat there during this whole thing, just looking like this, you know? And he said, Zen. That's all he said, Zen.
Zen?
One word, yeah. So I didn't ask him anything else. I got over and landed at the other lake and unloaded him and his stuff, and I flew home, and then I filed a report with OAS, because it was a OAS job. But I learned the hard way about unporting fuel tanks in a step turn. And I'll bet you a lot of pilots don't think of that. But then on the other hand, a lot of pilots don't like step turns. And I think they're fun, and they got me out of a hole so many times, because you can get on step and not use up all your lake. Whereas if you just start from scratch, by the time you get on a step, you're out of lake, you know, getting in the small lake. So even though this was a very low performing airplane, it was quite remarkable if you knew a couple of tricks.
That's incredible. And
now we have a bigger engine, bigger prop, and it's pretty remarkable airplane.
The funny thing that I've noticed about you here is that you keep saying, oh, I learned this lesson or learned that lesson, and there's a great story with every lesson learned. Do you have any other big lessons that you learned? Like what are the biggest lessons you've learned over the years?
Well, be sure and have plenty of fuel, because no matter what else you screw up, usually if you got plenty of fuel, you can dig your way out.
Do you have a story to go along with that lesson? I mean, other than one
I hate to tell you that I do. I've always been real serious about not running out of fuel and calculating our fuel. So years ago, I told you I learned in a Cessna 140 how to fly, and I wanted another 140 because I'd traded in my first one to buy a 172. And so it turns out there was one in New York that my brother-in-law knew about, and I flew out there, and we paid the guy and picked it up and headed back to, I only wanted to get as far as back to Missouri, and then later we'd figure out how to get into Alaska. So we stopped at a place in Pennsylvania to spend the night, and I got to looking at the manual, and I had forgotten all this from owning one before, but the fuel, I didn't see anything in the manual, which the manuals in the planes in those days were this little thing like this, and not much information. There was zero information about not unusable fuel in that airplane manual. And I thought, how am I going to figure out the unusable fuel? I couldn't find anything in the paperwork or anything. So I asked the guy at this little airport in Pennsylvania where we spent the night in his airport lounge. And he had a bunch of 140s on this airport. And I said, what's the unusable fuel in these airplanes? He said, oh, it's all usable. Well, that didn't sound right, but I ended up later looking at a little column I found, a little chart that showed miles, assuming still air, and fuel burn, and I was able to back engineer that, oh yeah, there's a certain amount of unusable fuel in the tanks. I think it's a gallon and a half or something like that. So it really is unusable fuel. But then again, if you can raise the wing a little bit, you can usually get most of it, you know. But you don't want to really count on that.
We're just flying a forward slip the whole time? How would you?
Well, that's what would happen. You'd slow down and make your predicament worse. But anyway, we landed in Cincinnati, an airport called Blue Ash, I'm not sure that's still there or not, but it was a great airport. Got fuel, and we take off, and it's in the afternoon. It's 4th of July, and it's hotter than blazes. And we're just getting thrashed by the turbulence. And we said, we got to go up higher. It's so hot. It's just making a mess of us physically. Yeah. So we climbed up high, and it got smooth. And we were up above a few little puffy clouds, and it was nice and smooth, but we picked up this big old fat headwind. So now, okay, we're comfortable, but we're not doing so good. Plus, most of those 140s in those days, they had this horrible mixture control, so everybody just tied them off, so you couldn't do anything to lean when you went up higher. So we're flying along, we're approaching St. Louis, and we wanted to land at an airport called Weiss, which was an amazing general aviation airport, which is now gone. And that was clear across St. Louis. I said, I think we should cancel that, and we should just land at what we called, I forget what we called it. At any rate, it's on the Illinois side, right across from the Arch, the St. Louis Arch. And they've called it a couple different names over the years. It was Bi-State Parks at the time, which was Parks College, which was an aviation school. I don't know what they call it today. So we said, we know when we took off, we need to look, and we know about what the fuel burn is. We need to figure out our exact fuel at this moment and see just where we're going to be. And I looked at my watch, and my watch had quit running. It had died. So I turned to my brother-in-law, who had a watch, and I said, "What time do you have?" His watch had died also. Wow. How would you lose 2 watches in one leg of one flight? Yeah. It happened. Yeah. So all of a sudden we realized we didn't know anything. Now we had a little old-fashioned aircraft radio, not as old as the old coffee grinders I used to fly and see, which were about as close to crystal radio as you could get, I think.
When you say coffee grinder, what does that mean?
They had a little knob to tune the frequency in that you would crank like this, and it looked like a little coffee grinder knob. So the problem with those radios is you would make a call, and if somebody was going to call you back on the frequency that you called on, like say you called Unicom, you could sort of see some crude numbers, and you were frantically rocking the knob back and forth to try to tune them in before they quit talking. And you just cursed people who would say, 352, go ahead. Because you didn't have time. What I really wanted was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 2, testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I wanted about 5 or 10 seconds of that so I could tune them in. Yeah. Now later they came out with a thing called whistle stop tuning, where you could press a little button and you could zero beat a signal and tell that you had your receiver turned correctly. Anyway, this was a Genève Alpha 200, and it was the next closest thing to a non-radio that you could get. It's a horrible thing. Yeah. And about the time you could see the airport over the cow is when you just see it starting to slide under the cow, that's when you could contact the station. In other words, about 4 or 5 miles out at best. Yeah. So we didn't know how much fuel we had, and I told brother-in-law, we gotta land at Bi-State Parks. And as we're approaching the Arch, we finally got a hold of the tower well inside their 5 miles. Oh. And they had this gigantic celebration along the river, and thousands of people on the river banks, and it was a big deal. It was all around the Arch and everything. He wanted me to do this 5 mile downwind, and we probably did about a half a mile downwind. He didn't say a word. And as we touched and let the tail down, the engine quit. And I told my brother-in-law, and I had him doing a lot of the flying because he needed experience. I said, don't touch the brakes. And I think maybe letting the tail down unported the fuel again. And we kept our speed up, and we coasted into the gas pumps and just ran out of speed just as we rolled up to the gas pumps. We looked like these hot dogs that like to do that, shut the engine off 2 blocks from the gas pumps and coast in. Yeah. I didn't mean to look like that, but that's what we did.
You just did. You have to look,
And we put gas in that airplane and shoot it, took more fuel than what the capacity of the tanks were, not even talking about unusable.
So that you have negative unusable.
Yeah, negative, yeah. So
How much? That's what I was going to say. How much did it take? Did you figure that out exactly right there?
Yeah, it's those airplanes I think have a little bit smaller tanks than the 150, and I think our capacity was like maybe 23 gallons, and I think a 150's 25, not counting unusable. So that taught me a lesson about running out of gas. Don't ever do that. So I've done a pretty good job of not running out of gas over the years. I'll never.
I think that's one advice you would give me. Just know is that I need to be more conscious and more precise with my fuel.
Yeah. But then you need a margin in case the weather goes haywire.
Right, exactly.
Headwinds come up, you know.
But I've always just said, well, I know I have way more margin than I need, you know, but it's not precise. I would like to be precise plus margin.
Well, there's a lot.
And it's kind of hard with this because it's like, how much fuel do you have in there? Right. Do you have any advice on that?
Well, there's a lot to be said for fuel totalizers. You put in, you know exactly what you're starting with.
Yeah. And
those things do an incredible job of keeping track of the fuel. Now it's, you know, garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't know how much you started with.
Right. You don't know.
But the way you know is on those few times that you top the tanks off, then you can say, okay, here's my fuel. And then as you, over the next few weeks, as you continue to use fuel and add fuel, you always put in how much, it's keeping track how much has been used, but you always put in how much you added.
Do you think that the fuel pumps, the counter on the fuel pump is accurate? Is that what you're going off of as far as knowing how much you put in?
Well, they have a little, well, yeah, I found that's pretty accurate. I mean, the state laws. And then that's another thing, I always check.
Yeah.
In other words, when I put gas in, I'm finding out how much gas did I put in versus how much did I think I should have put in.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And over time, I gain confidence in those systems and say, okay, this is over 2 or 3 fill-ups, I've lost a half a gallon or a gallon or something.
Yeah.
You know? So you'll never get it perfect because the way the plane sits on the ramp, and like you say, the pumps probably aren't perfectly accurate, but they're a nice help. But still, you don't want to count on them down to the last gallon.
Yeah.
So we made a trip down to down the coast and flew all over the lower 48 and back, Sun and Fun and the Eclipse and all that. And when we were going down, we wanted to do nonstop from Ketchikan to Washington State. And I ran the numbers over and over and over again, and I came up with, we're going to be between half hour and 45 minutes reserve when we get down there. And that wasn't counting going into the unusable fuel, which, God forbid, you can get some of that unusable fuel out by raising a wing and stuff like that. You didn't hear me say that.
Yeah.
But when I looked at the weather on that end of the trip was kind of crummy, and and you got to dodge around different airspace. Canada's airspace gets real busy right there. You don't know how much you're going to get vectored and stuff like that. And I said, we're just not going to do that. It's legal, but it's not safe.
Totally.
So
it's like the longer your leg is, that reserve should get more. The percentage of your leg, not an amount.
That's a very good observation.
Yeah.
Because the chance of error gets higher the more you fly it and the more you burn. But I have done it. I did it in cessna 172 one time and had plenty of fuel. I got a little spooked at the end of the trip and landed to buy fuel earlier than I planned. And come to find out, my calculations right. We had all kinds of fuel on board. But I didn't have a totalizer, and I was just looking at the gauges and seeing them get on down made me nervous. So I always say, believe the worst story. You read stories where people run out of gas and they
buy into the best story.
Exactly. How'd you know that?
Yeah.
That's what they do.
Yeah.
And they'll see the gauges looking really bad and keep right on going.
And they do the math. They go off. The gauges look bad, but the math looks good, or whatever.
Maybe their mistaken math looks good.
Right.
So that's.
But but they don't know the math's mistaken, and they go, "Well, that's the math. I'm gonna just, that's interesting. Believe the worst story. I love that."
And then who knows how well your tanks are filled? had a 172 that I would fuel on a little bit of a slope. So when it was full, then the fuel would run across to the tank that was low. And then even if you had the fuel selected off, there was a vent line that fed across, and it would feed across that vent line. And then you would go back out to go somewhere, and you could even maybe turn the airplane around, put another 2 or 3 gallons in. That was beyond. And I would fly a 50, 60 mile flight regularly, and these guys would always come rushing out to sell you gas. And finally one day I gave in and said, okay, yeah, you put some gas in. I think I'd flown maybe 60 miles, and they got a half a gallon in the tank. That's all they could get. Wow, this is quite an efficient airplane. So, but you don't want to count on any of that stuff.
Yeah.
Just if you have plenty of fuel, you have lots of options. And and the other option that I've seen, in accident reports and stuff, you know that the person bypassed some opportunities to get fuel. And could have. So I like to buy fuel every chance I get, and try to carry a reasonable load that full fuel doesn't put you over. So
I have to admit a mistake I made once. I was flying over by Squintna. I went back into the Alaska range a bit, and we were exploring around. And I'd calculated my fuel to get back to Wasilla. And I had a friend with me who's not a pilot. And we were flying back, and I was like, I'm going to definitely stop in Willow to get fuel, because I'm not sure that I can get to Wasilla. So as we get to Willow, I said, okay, I'm going to land at Willow. And he kind of goes, Wasilla's just right there. You can see the Wasilla airport from Willow. He goes, and we would have gone like a mile or two to get into the pattern of Willow, or I could just go to Wasilla. And I was like, oh, good point, bro. And I just went. But I thought about that decision, which there was 0 consequences of forever, and going, but I didn't know for sure. And he was just like, oh, it's fine, bro. Well, what does he know? I just bought into his story and was like, yeah, you're making a good point.
And at the same time, how many accidents have you read about where the guy ran out of fuel just on the final and just almost made it to the airport?
Yeah, totally.
So you'd feel sick if you messed up your airplane over a gallon or 2 of fuel.
Yeah.
So
exactly. A 10-minute diversion, to land and fuel up and take off again. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing that I enjoy flying VFR, and I flew many, many hours of IFR in a earlier life, and here in Alaska, 135 whenever we were allowed to fly it, in the few cases where we could. I haven't flown much with the newer equipment, some GPS stuff, but not like I used to, and don't have the reason to, or the occasion. But with VFR, I try to not go direct if it doesn't make any sense. I don't know if that's...
I don't understand what you mean.
Well, okay, so let's say you got bad weather between here and here, and you got mountains and stuff like that. If there's a way to go around, why not just go around instead of going direct? I can't tell you how many times I've personally been involved and seen and been close to accidents where the guy flew direct to get somewhere he was going and ended up having a fatal crash, him and his passengers, when all he had to do was go around. And even going through the mountains, you still can a lot of times work your way through if you don't think you have to go direct. Ignore
Pick
that
a different pass or
different
something.
pass, and if one doesn't look good, turn around and go try another one. And usually there's multiple ways to it. Some are a little higher and some are better than others. Or but the amazing thought that I think people miss is, do I really have to get there? And if it looks that bad and I don't see any ways to go around, what would be wrong with just going back and landing? And I think of the times that I have gone through Windy Pass and different places and just said, okay, I've had enough of this, and turned around. Then usually then there's something that's unusual, that's different than a regular trip. Like one time we turned around and I had some good father-son time with my youngest boy when we turned around and spent the night in the cabin. Had we made it all the way through, it would have just been another trip that would have blended into the fog with all the other trips I've had. But we had a great time, and I remember that trip, and I thought, boy, if there's a good excuse to maybe turn around and land or something, maybe you ought to take it.
That's such great advice. It's almost like you're inviting more adventure. You know, I'm going to turn around and go back, and the thing that I had planned to do is not going to happen. So the rest of the day is, it's kind of I love that idea of it being something to look forward to, rather than to be like, oh, shoot, we failed.
Yeah, I've seen that over and over. Debbie and I on this recent trip, we landed short of our destination and spent the night in, let's see, what was it? Pendleton, Oregon. I've never been to Pendleton, Oregon, but now I have.
Yeah.
And I looked at the mountains up ahead, and we were flying. We'd got across the first set of mountains just fine. It was easy to work our way through that. The second set looked pretty darn black and pretty darn solid and looked like pretty serious mountains. There was a pass up there, but I didn't go out far enough to actually see if I could see through the pass. And it was starting to get a little bit dark, and I said, why bother? Just land here. The hotel wasn't very expensive, and we landed and walked over and had a little dinner, and it was just a memorable part of our trip. I won't forget.
Yeah,
Whereas if I'd have passed on through, I wouldn't remember any of that.
I love it.
So, yeah.
So the thing you were saying about going around, weather or whatever, not going direct when you're flying VFR, and the fuel, it's like those are two interesting things to put together, because it's like, well, now you're talking more fuel burn.
But if you have enough, then you got an option there to go around. But I've watched, I could relate a terrible story, which is probably that wasn't me flying, but another person. But still, I take note of all this. I think it's up to us as pilots to study these accidents and say, okay, what do I need to do to avoid this person's fate?
Right.
But a particularly awful accident where the person wanted to go straight. He didn't need to go straight. If he'd have deterred 5 miles off course, the land was all sea level instead of trying to cross a 800-foot ridge or something. So he ended up running in the ridge and killed himself and running a nice airplane. And having previously flown with this individual, I knew that his idea was, hey, airplanes can go straight. They need to go straight. They should go straight. And I thought, wait a minute. Airplane doesn't have to go straight. It can go any way it wants to. It doesn't have to follow the road. So I've just watched that over and over and over again. I could write a small book about these kinds of accidents where the pilot thought he had to go straight.
That's very interesting. You've said several things this evening that I had never heard before. Ways of saying things and new ideas, and that's one of them. What's one piece of advice, we kind of need to wrap this up, but a piece of advice that you would give me specifically?
I feel like very strongly that you need some kind of backup for things completely go to pieces and you didn't expect it, and because it can happen.
Yeah.
We know what the weather is where we're leaving from. Less often we don't know what the weather is where we're going. More often we don't know where it is where we're going. And certainly in between, we usually don't know what we have. And things can change. You can go out, take your nap, get ready to come home, and things have changed. So I feel like you need some backup. I've been pretty impressed with the tablets and the for-flight type programs, and with the AHRS equipment in the ADS-B receiver. You get to see other airplanes. Plus, they can put a horizon on or a DG on
and that's the little box that you can mount in your plane somewhere?
Or just lay it up on the top of the instrument panel. And there's some very good ones, and there's good programs that run on both Android and Apple. The one that everybody loves is the for-flight. But I use one that I really like called iFly GPS. There's 2 or 3 more. and they work on Android, so you're not investing quite so much. And for example, the one that I have, I don't have it with me, but it actually puts a little artificial horizon on the screen, on the corner of the screen, and it works. It flat works.
Yeah.
And it also puts a DG on there.
That is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I think it is.
My friend just got an airplane, and he's working on getting his pilot's license, and he's mounting one of those in his Super Cub.
You can permanently mount it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's better than it flopping around, right?
Yeah.
But I think that is such a cool piece of technology. But what you're suggesting is it's a backup.
Yeah.
It's a straight backup.
Should be a backup, and it's I mean, it's not like having an instrument on the panel.
Yeah.
Now, years ago, IFR, I had several vacuum pump failures. In the day, it was just common to have a vacuum pump failure. Now we have vacuum pumps that you can check the condition of. If you get involved working on airplanes, you see if you have a vacuum pump, you can put a little gauge down and it can tell how much the carbon veins have worn. But because of that, I bought an electric horizon and installed, so it didn't depend on the vacuum. And that thing was a godsend. The other thing that I learned is if you don't let a turn develop, and this is before all this modern moving map stuff, if you don't let a turn develop, then you're not likely to lose control of the airplane, get a big steep bank or anything like that. Certainly if gross things are happening, the horizon's nice. But the horizon's not primary when everything's going halfway decent. You look at your DG to see what's going on.
Yeah.
And flying at night, by the way, does a lot to really help you with starting to get used to your instruments a little more.
Yeah.
So what I liked was the ADF, ADB, because I could turn that thing on if I had a good one in the airplane. And I love to have good ones in the airplane. Now, this is another day today when people are ripping them out so they have more room for GPS and stuff like that. But if nothing else, you can listen to something on the radio while you're flying if you have a good ADF.
Yeah.
But if I tuned that in to where it would point at a station, then I could tell precise. I had a DG in the airplane. It acted very much like a DG.
Yeah.
It pointed to the station, say I could tune in a station in front. If I saw the needle move off to the side, that meant I'd started to turn. And there was at least 2 times, maybe 3, that I used a good quality ADF that was working correctly to get myself out of a fix where the vacuum pump had died. And where I was flying a different airplane that didn't have a backup horizon or any of that. So I just absolutely loved it for that. Now everybody says, oh, you don't need that. You can use your moving map, GPS stuff, and then do the same thing. And I agree. Now the early versions of that stuff only updated once a second. So they were kind of sloppy when it came to that.
Yeah.
But this new stuff, I think, updates 4 times a second or maybe even better.
Crazy. Yeah.
So you could get one of those tablets. You can buy an Android tablet for $100, and nice one, and buy a subscription that might cost you $100 a year. And then the expensive part is the receiver, the ADSB receiver. Yeah. One with the AHRS, and of course the one I think that is pretty popular these days is Stratus 3 or something like that.
So everything I feel like it's very interesting that I would ask you for advice and that's what you'd bring up. Are you saying that, so that's not me working on myself. That's something that I can get that's a safety equipment. So what's the self-work on thing?
Well, I'd get the instrument rating even if you're not using it.
Yeah.
It's someday you may put another instrument or 2 in this airplane.
Or I'd get a different plane. And that's definitely basically, I mean, I just have to commit to it and do it. And it's sort of been on my list for the last year or so that it's like, okay, I am definitely going to get that, but I don't want to say it here because if we put this out, then everyone will hold me accountable and it'll be frustrating. But man, what an honor this has been. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's fun